Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane, and joining us today, we have Kyle Anzalone. Kyle, how's it going?
Doing great, Pat. How are you doing?
Doing good, man. I'm so glad to have you back. It's been a real long time since I had just you on the show, so if you want to remind everyone who you are and what you do, that'd be awesome.
I'm Kyle Anzalone. I'm the opinion editor of antiwar.com. Right now at antiwar.com, we're holding a fundraiser. So if you can, head on over and support. I'm also the news editor at the Libertarian Institute and the co-host of the Conflicts of Interest podcast.
Yeah, make sure you guys go on over to antiwar.com. It's the most important project on the internet. And you guys have really awesome endorsements that keep flowing in from all these huge figures. And it's really great to see. I mean, Noam Chomsky, Colonel Douglas McGregor up there. Some others, I don't know if you want to say who else.
I think today on the page is John Mearsheimer,
okay,
who's, the great scholar who's been doing so much work and, a part of so many of the debates that really seep out into the mainstream about what's going on in Ukraine and who's really responsible for what's happened in that country for the past 8 years.
Yeah, and I think it's great, too, because I think that Dave DeCamp was saying on his podcast, Anti-War News, he was talking about how John Mearsheimer's lectures on YouTube have like hundreds of thousands of hits.
I think some have over 1 million now.
Yeah, so. Well, that's incredible. And it's just a testament to how important antiwar.com is. So head on over antiwar.com/donate. So today I wanted to bring you on, Kyle, to talk a bit about something you've been covering and that I have not covered on the show is escalations with North Korea in the Korean Peninsula. And I thought first, we'd just start with kind of the general background of the Trump administration, because it seems like we were making some diplomatic headways during his administration. And now I'm hoping you can tell us about how that's going out the window.
Yeah. So, as with almost anything in Trump, you got a little bit of a mixed bag. Remember when he took office, he's calling Kim Little Rocket Man on Twitter. They're threatening to use their red buttons. He promised fire and fury. At one point, it really seemed like the Democrats were saying like, hey, look, we were right. This guy took office. Look how brash he is. Look how he's using Twitter. And, now we're in this position where we're talking about potential nuclear weapon use on the Korean Peninsula. At the time, North Korea in 2017 carried out their most recent nuclear test. They had tested intercontinental ballistic missile. The CIA was putting out statements at the time saying things like North Korea maybe didn't have a missile capable of hitting the United States, but really all they needed was to work on the cap for their intercontinental ballistic missile so that it could survive re-entry with the nuclear warhead intact. And at that point, they could carry out strikes against the United States of America. And, certainly even if they don't use an ICBM, they had missiles that were shorter range that could hit targets in the Pacific, Guam, Japan, South Korea, the U.S. base at Okinawa, Hawaii, within the range of their other missiles. And so, there's a real threat and a real concern at the beginning of the Trump administration that we're talking about nuclear war with North Korea. And then maybe the one lone decent thing that Mike Pompeo did, maybe in his entire life, was as head of the CIA. I believe it was in November of 2017. They put out a statement saying that, look, Kim Jong-un isn't irrational and the North Korea isn't going to mindlessly use their nuclear weapons program. I think that Trump really actually took that seriously, because after that, we got a series of letters between Trump and Kim that resulted in positive diplomacy. And so in 2018, we end up with the Singapore summit. I believe that's in the summer, maybe June. And there's a real chance that, the beginning stages of diplomacy really solidify there. At that point, North Korea agrees that they're going to freeze missile tests. They scale back a couple of their missile engine testing facilities. They closed one of their nuclear weapons testing facilities. And the U.S. and Japan, South Korea also rolled back their programs, not their programs, their war games. They stopped conducting live fire war games, and so twice a year at least, the U.S. and South Korea had carried out major war games simulating the overthrow of the North Korean government, and they did this at times that lined up with the harvest, and so it would force either during the planting season for North Korea to call up all their reservists to be prepared in case these war games were just cover for an invasion, because they did signal again and simulate decapitation, regime change in Pyongyang. And additionally, North Korea would carry out their own forms of militarization. I think that's a big part of, kind of what keeps the North Korean government in power and everything is its symbolic military posture. And so when the U.S. and South Korea carry out war games, Pyongyang feels the need to reciprocate to show that, we are a military power as well to their own internal population, I think is a big part of this. Now, at the same time, there's another really important event that happens around this time. And the president of South Korea actually gets kicked out of office. Her name is Park, and ends up getting a jail sentence. I don't know if she ever serves time, but she's convicted of corruption. Actually, I think sentenced about 8 years in prison. And this paves the way for Moon Jae-in to become president of South Korea. And this is somebody who in the past was a part of the Sunshine program between North and South Korea. This is encouraging joint business along the demilitarized zone. And another big thing that they do is because the demilitarized zone, the border between North and South Korea is really an arbitrary thing that was established mostly by the United States. There's a lot of people who are Korean who, are on the south side of the border, but their mom or their brother, their sister is on the north side of the border. And so for decades and decades, these people didn't get to see each other. And so during this sunshine period, there's a lot of these family visits and things like that going on. And so Moon Jae-in's a part of that. He's, just a big believer in Korean diplomacy and, the Korean people finding some way to de-escalate. And so with Donald Trump, now in a position 2018 where he's looking for diplomacy. In South Korea, in Seoul, he has Moon Jae-in, who's really looking for diplomacy, who's extending every olive branch he could find to Kim Jong-un. And then you have Kim, who, reciprocates here and takes steps in North Korea to show that they're serious. During this period, there's really monumental things. I mean, some of the coolest things that I have seen as an anti-war activist are, soldiers from North Korea, South Korea, just meeting and shaking hands, exchanging cigarettes along the demilitarized zone. That was occurring during this period. They were blowing up military posts along the demilitarized zone, but North Korea was blowing up their own military posts. South Korea was dismantling theirs. They were getting rid of mines along the DMZ. This was a really positive period. And then John Bolton. In 2019, the Hanoi summit, there's reports that at this summit, we're going to get an end to the Korean War, an end to the hostile American military presence. Major agreements were supposed to be made in Hanoi. And rather than doing what he planned to do when he got there, Donald Trump listened to John Bolton, the evil walrus with a mustache, who just loves every war, has destroyed every agreement he could possibly find. A big part of the reason why North Korea has nuclear weapons in the first place has to do with John Bolton. So during the beginning of the Bush administration, they end up putting North Korea on the the axis of evil with Iran and Iraq, right? Which makes no sense at all. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, but they do that, and so North Korea takes that very seriously. And since the Bush administration wasn't abiding by the agreements they had with Pyongyang at the time, anyways, North Korea decides to make nuclear weapons, and in big part, John Bolton plays a role in that. So a man who has destroyed now 4 or 5 international agreements that limit the capacity of nuclear weapons. I mean, if you could think of like an antichrist-like figure in our society today, like somebody whose sole goal it is to make sure that the world ends in a nuclear fire, like John Bolton certainly fills that role quite clearly. He was key in destroying the anti-ballistic missile treaty and the intermediate nuclear forces treaty with Russia, the agreed framework with North Korea, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. And then here again, we have a chance to really scale back tensions, to make peace in the world. And John Bolton goes and blows it up. Now, Trump let it happen. We can't excuse the president here, but as the advisor, John Bolton plays a huge role in just absolutely nuking talks, rather than the more reasonable agreement that Trump was looking at, a step-by-step type agreement where the military presence and the hostility on the Korean Peninsula is slowly ratcheted down over time. John Bolton convinces Trump that Trump goes to the North Koreans and says, now look here, you're going to give up your nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons right now. And the North Koreans say, thank you very much. Have a nice day. Don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. And Kim goes back to Pyongyang. And, that's the end of diplomacy. But even then, for the remainder of the Trump period, there's enough, mainly I think because of Moon Jae-in at this point in South Korea, like he's really trying to get diplomacy. American sanctions actually prevent more diplomacy from happening. South Korea is trying to open offices in North Korea. North Korea, reciprocates and things. These things can't happen because of American sanctions, and because the South Korea violates those sanctions, then they'll face secondary sanctions. And so American sanctions really hindered Moon's effort at peace, and then Trump just never made a serious enough effort. When he went to the DMZ in 2020 and met Kim Jong-un there, another historic moment, big moment. And, one of the things that we talked about on the show at the time, and I think me and Will Porter wrote an article on this, if you look, John Bolton is actually sent to Mongolia when Donald Trump is meeting Kim Jong-un in the DMZ, and it's Tucker Carlson that, is more there as an advisor than John Bolton. But it was too little too late. Again, North Korea wanted this step-by-step process. And so then when Joe Biden took office, he says, well, I'm going to split the difference between Obama, where nothing happened for 8 years. The Obama administration called it strategic patience, which basically meant they just put the North Korea file on the back burner. North Korea carried out tests. The people there suffered under the American sanctions, but, there was no other policy changes. The U.S. just says that North Korea must give up all their nuclear weapons, or we're not going to engage in talks. And so Biden, while he said he was going to split the difference, basically he just adopted the Obama position, which is North Korea must give up their nuclear weapons. And at the start of the year, we saw North Korea respond to this. This is beginning 2022 by carrying out a series of missile tests, breaking their new missile freeze that they had for several years under the Trump administration, right at the beginning of the Biden administration. But then the most important event probably that's happened under the Biden administration, and this gets lost in everything else, which is understandable. But in May, there was a NATO summit in Spain, in Madrid, and a lot of very important things happened there. NATO named China an adversary, right? Like this is huge. However, on the sidelines of that, the South Koreans and the Japanese come, and the U.S. signs a trilateral agreement with South Korea and Japan to increase military ties. North Korea denounces this as a NATO-style alliance aimed at overthrowing Pyongyang. And, there's a lot of historic problems here, too. Like, World War II isn't that long ago. And we have to remember that, while the atrocities of Germany, are always, taught first and really are first in American culture, the Japanese committed a lot of atrocities within their imperial zone. Not only in China, but particularly in Korea, where they enslaved a lot of the men and turned the women into comfort women, and just made them sex slaves for Japanese soldiers, right? Like, Japanese soldiers were just allowed to rape the Korean women. Like, this is what the Japanese did to Korea. And so, America partnering with the Japanese in a military alliance is obviously seen as a major threat in Pyongyang. World War II isn't that long ago. There's still survivors of this. There's comfort women in South Korea who are still demanding more reparations. I don't know what they actually label it, but basically they feel that justice was in no way done for what was done to them during World War II. And I'm sure the number of those women is pretty close to zero now, as just the number of World War II people who are alive during that time period is really dwindling. But anyways, so that's a big part of what happened. And then this summer, the U.S. carried out its first round of live fire military drills with South Korea in 5 years. Then we sent an aircraft carrier for the first time since 2018, and then Kamala Harris went to the DMZ, just slammed the North Korean government. And look, the North Korean government is one of the most oppressive governments to its own people in the world, of course, as compounded by U.S. sanctions and everything like that. But is what's happening in North Korea, the starvation there, any worse than the starvation that we're facilitating in Yemen? But again, we have to condemn Kim Jong-un. We can't go and condemn Mohammed bin Salman, right? The crown prince of Saudi Arabia. And so this is all politics, right? They don't actually care about the people of North Korea or anything like that. Kamala Harris went because she needs to build her foreign policy profile if she ever hopes to actually be elected president of the United States. And the way you do that as a Democrat in the United States is you go to foreign countries and then you look at other foreign countries and you say, hey, I'm going to stick my finger in your eye as many times as I can and say, you have to do exactly what we say. We will not engage in diplomacy. We're not going to make concessions. You do what we want or else. And that's what she did. And the North Koreans reacted predictably by carrying out more missile tests. And so in the past, I think we're at like 16 days now, Pat, that we've had North Korea fire, I believe, 15 total missiles and 8 separate tests. This is going back to right at the end of September. They carried the past 2 weeks have been very busy. North Korea has also, this is far more notable. They've carried out now 2 sets of aerial maneuvers with warplanes, bombers, and fighter jets that approached the South Korean border. And again, missile tests have been very common, although a record number have occurred this year. That's, worth noting, including the first intercontinental ballistic missile test by North Korea since 2017. They also recently fired a missile that crossed over Japanese territory. North Korea said it was a new version of their intermediate range missile. But these, these flights near the South Korean border, I think they approach within 12 miles of the DMZ and then 7 miles of the dividing line in the Yellow Sea, where you have the de facto water barrier between North and South Korea. And so I think that probably, I should also mention that this week, North Korea had their, the Workers' Party there, the ruling party in North Korea, held their 77th anniversary, and they announced they had developed underwater silos that could fire nuclear capable missiles. So I believe that about catches us up, Pat.
Yeah, these are I mean, it seems to be put into place in the context of this great power competition narrative that we talk about so often in this show. And if you go to the national defense strategies that have come out in 2018 and then in 2020, of course, it focuses on confronting China, and then Russia is an immediate threat, but China's the long-term pacing threat. But then you have rogue regimes of Iran and North Korea being named. And so, I mean, it just seems like this is just another part of a full court press by the Biden administration, a continuance of policy, but here we are.
I find that the policies against North Korea and Iran to be just frustrating, Pat. I feel like if you're in Washington and you are just convinced that China is going to be a major competitor of the U.S. and we have to do something about it, fine. But then that means that you have to get along with North Korea and Iran, right? If you want to be able to put more pressure on Beijing, one of their key international partners is the North Korean government. And Donald Trump missed the chance to really normalize relations. North Korea would not have been a military bulwark that the United States had to worry about had Donald Trump just moved forward with the Singapore summit plan. He unwinding that, I'm sure, is helpful to Beijing, because then that maintains the hostile policy between North Korea and the U.S. and keeps a military ally for North Korea right on, I guess it's what, northwestern border, as and then of course it shares a border with Russia too, and so you would think that resolving this problem and at least having a neutral state in North Korea on the Chinese and Russian border would be absolutely huge, but there's no interest in that whatsoever. I mean, of course, I think the Iranian example is more obvious, where the Biden administration is freaking out because OPEC says they're going to produce 2 million less barrels of oil per day. Do you know where you could produce 2 million more barrels of oil a day? Iran and Venezuela, two countries the United States have sanctioned because they're less bad to their own people than like some inner city American cities, but certainly like a lot of American allies like the Israelis and the Saudis. They treat the Shia in Saudi Arabia like absolute dirt. Israel's an apartheid state, and we have no problem giving them military aid so we can at least relax the sanctions on Iran to drive down the price of oil and hurt Moscow. And there's just no interest in doing this whatsoever, Pat. It's baffling, from an observer of this. If you really, really, really wanted to do something about Vladimir Putin and Russia, you have obvious, easy wins in Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea, and there's just no interest in it whatsoever. And in fact, we've pushed so far on all these issues. Iran is now in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. North Korea is offering to give troops and military equipment to Russia to use in Ukraine. It's becoming to the point where it's going to be harder and harder, to move these countries at least back to a neutral standing with the U.S. because we've been so aggressive with them and have maintained this policy of regime change against their governments for so long, and completely unnecessarily so. All you have is they're bad to their people. Yeah, a lot of people are bad to a lot of people around the world. And a lot of those people are in those places because America puts them there. And so, we could, again, just cut the military aid to Israel. We could stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. We could not endorse Morocco's occupation and annexation of Western Sahara, the 500,000 people who live there under, a brutal occupation, right? We endorse that. So Morocco will normalize ties and say that we recognize Israel. Right. We don't have to do any of that, and we can help people all over the world, and we choose not to. And so it's clearly just a policy of outright militarism everywhere possible.
Yeah, and I think it's not even Patrick McFarlane and Kyle Anzalone anti-war activists who are recognizing the folly of this policy. I mean, there's people in the mainstream. I've seen articles, in places like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but War on the Rocks is more of an insider intelligence outfit. And I'm pretty sure I've seen, articles there talking about what is our policy doing? It's pushing Russia and China closer together, not to mention these other states.
Right. And I mean, for the most part, like Kelly Vlahos is absolutely awesome and previously worked with antiwar.com. But most of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft are, admitted foreign policy realists. They're not, people who are anti-war saying that I want to dismantle the Pentagon. They don't want to do that. They say there are threats to America. America needs to maintain some military. They're just saying that, look, right, like, let's play strategy here and let's make this make sense so that we're pursuing goals that we could actually achieve, and that we're not like, we don't have like 10 different foreign policy objectives that are conflicting and contradicting with each other. They're making it harder to achieve the goal against Russia, to also pursue this aggressive chalk against Iran. And yet there's like no realization or discussion that, hey, we have to pick one here. We could achieve one of these two, but we can't do both. So which one like those discussions apparently don't happen in the White House. But, even increasingly on the pages of foreign policy, I feel like we end up with these discussions. And again, I'm not necessarily advocating for like my anti-war position here, but I just admit, like, I try to put myself in the position of, let's say, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, right? Who it's his job to advise the president on how best to achieve his foreign policy goals, right? Like you would have to sit there and just yell at Joe Biden every day and say, pick one. You can't do everything. This isn't 1990 anymore when we just had the fall of the Soviet Union and America has this unipolar moment and can control almost every last corner of the globe. Although even then you have to acknowledge that, the Bush administration with their unipolar moment, the first thing they did is said, yeah, we can't meddle too much on Russia's borders. So, we're not going to expand NATO eastward and things like that. Now, during the Clinton administration, they do, and there's nothing that Russia could do about it. But again, even at that time, the realists or even the Cold War era, like foreign policy planners, Kennan and the rest of them, Matlack even recently wrote an article on this, that, they're all screaming saying, what are you doing? You can't do all this at one time.
Yeah, it's incredible. And well, to take a little bit of a step back too, one thing I often hear is from humanitarian interventionists. They'll point to the Korean War as an example of the United States intervention actually ending up well, right? And so people don't realize the things about that war. I mean, one is that technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war, and the demilitarized zone, it's an active military area where there are military assets on both sides. And of course, that has kind of waxed and waned over the years. But you're really ignoring the reality of the U.S. intervention and the bombing campaigns that took place on the Korean Peninsula and all of the wholesale slaughter, not to mention, like, the end result was still a war that lasted in perpetuity since that intervention.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you nailed it at the end. It didn't resolve anything, the war, right? It just created a perpetual frozen conflict. And who knows how many billions or even near trillions of dollars the U.S. has spent now trying to combat the Korean government for the past, 7 decades now. But if you look, I think the estimates are like 20 to 25% of the North Korean population was killed by the American bombing campaign in North Korea. You have generals from the time talking about how they destroyed any structure that was over 2 stories in the whole, so these are just people's houses. They just like carpet bombed all in North Korea, and this is something that you had to remember too, when you talk about the position of North Korea and why Kim Jong-un has such a huge control over his country. If you had an event within, living memory where 10 to 20% of your country, we're talking more here, but even it feels like 5 or 10% of your country was wiped out by a single event, then chances are you're going to orient your society to make sure that event doesn't happen again, right? And so when we're talking 25% of the Korean people wiped out here, this is gives the Kim family, the Kim dynasty, a lot of, just political cover to continue to do what they've been doing this whole time. But I also want to mention here just that the U.S. used biological weapons in North Korea. It's pretty clear. The evidence is pretty much there that, yeah, they did try to drop it and spread the plague in North Korea. And so how can you justify a war where you did that at all? Like how can you say, so this and this makes it okay that you tried to start a plague?
Yeah, and that'd be a good topic for me to do one of these documentaries on that I'm working on. But I wrote about how there was an article called Pot Meat Kettle that I released at the Libertarian Institute, going over, because at the time they were threatening to use, at least they were threatening NATO to get involved, possibly escalate to nuclear, if Russia used chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so I wrote this piece about how the United States has done that time and time again over the last 100 years. So, not to mention smallpox blankets, right? This is the Trail of Tears, and domestically, the United States used these. So, yeah, chemical warfare in the past. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitch fix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at Pat McFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. Well, one thing, Kyle, that I think of is that if we're planning this whole great power competition and possibly aligning the chess pieces for war on 3 fronts, at least, maybe 4 fronts across the world, don't discount the power, a powerful ally that North Korea would be to China and Russia if that were to happen. And I'm not saying that North Korea would be able to project strength around the area. I mean, which is possible. I guess they have the capability of launching nuclear weapons. But if the United States, I mean, ultimately, we would have to either nuke the hell out of that country, like we tried to with Japan, or we would have to do a conventional invasion, which could turn into a quagmire in of itself. I think that if the United States tried now to wage a war against Korea, North Korea, we would have our hands. I mean, it would be like, I don't know, Afghanistan times 5. Is that
Yeah, North Korea has a fairly advanced and large military now. Like how much of their technology is actually going to work the way they say it does whenever the bombs start falling is one major question. But things that don't take a lot of a technological advancement, like artillery positions, like Seoul isn't that far from the DMZ. And from my understanding, North Korea has just a massive amount of artillery. And these are just, dumb bombs, right? There's nothing complicated here. It's unlikely that a large amount of these systems are going to fail. And I think, Seoul and the 30 plus million people that live there would face a really, really terrible wrath if war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. But, just kind of pointing out here, Russia and China's view, I imagine they're very happy to have a stalwart anti-American government right on, their far eastern borders, especially for Russia. I know like that area is kind of sparsely populated and everything like that. And having North Korea with Kim's nuclear weapons arsenal and, his absolute hatred and, steadfast stance against the Americans could be really useful if a larger conflict broke out over Ukraine, to ensure that, the Americans aren't going to, because again, if you have like an ally or a neutral state right there, then you could put a significant amount of military capabilities right on the Korean Peninsula, and that would be a major threat for Russia and China. But as of right now, there's a major military that's not Russia or China that exists between the American military capabilities. And again, I'm not advocating for this. I'm an anti-war activist, but if I were sitting in the White House and trying to play Risk or whatever they sit around trying to do, I think that'd be one of the things I recommend.
Yeah. And I was thinking too about, would Russia or China just sit idly by and let the United States lob nukes into North Korea? Like, I don't think so either. I mean, this is not the end of World War II where we could just do it and get away with it.
Right. I agree. I think it would be a lot more difficult now. And, with nuclear weapons being what they are and the disputed water territories, I think especially off of Korea's east coast there, that this could probably create some real problems with Russia and nuclear fallout, the fishing grounds and everything like that.
Now, in terms of, I guess, parallels, because there were certain times during the end of the Trump administration where I think it seemed that he might actually have some kind of military action against Venezuela or Iran. And at the time, I mean, we're not military specialists or analysts or anything like that. But I mean, is the United States in any position even to wage a war against a single one of those and have it be successful?
I mean, if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, then obviously no. And it depends on what the meaning of success would be too. If we want to kill Kim Jong-un, the Ayatollah, Maduro, that's probably very possible. That's not going to create a better situation for anyone, though. I mean? And so it depends on what the foreign policy goal was. But, to fight a war and then to have a state in Venezuela, Iran, or North Korea that is more favorable to the U.S. government and somewhat stable seems really, really unlikely, at least at anywhere near the cost that America is willing to pay. I mean, these countries, I guess Iraq has about 30 million people. I'm not sure what the population in North Korea is. I think Venezuela is like 39 million. Iran's huge. Iran has like 80 million people. So, that really, I think Iran is maybe the most unachievable if you're actually talking about a war. North Korea's nuclear arsenal makes it essentially unachievable. Venezuela's location, size, lack of nuclear weapons, the U.S. could probably go in there, throw the government up against the wall, kick the ass out of the Venezuelan military, kill a few 100,000 people, mostly innocent civilians, and not face too many repercussions. Like, it wouldn't crumble the U.S. empire, but we wouldn't create a more sustainable state in Venezuela. We wouldn't have access to more of their oil. Likely, then we would end up with a far more authoritarian and anti-American government, I would guess, in Venezuela if we did that. But, when war breaks out, who knows what's going to happen, which is part of the reason why you don't start wars. Yeah,
well, so one like envisionment that I have is we haven't really seen much of a major, huge scale war, I guess, at least since World War II. But I mean, there's examples since then. But now in the age where, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, we're still in Iraq, we're still in Syria, there are these things happening. I just always assume that every war, if you win it conventionally, will turn into some kind of insurgency. And maybe that's not an accurate prediction, but it's like when we get into a new war, all we do is we try to fight the last war, because that's what we know and that's where we think conflict is going to be and what it's going to look like. But now, with technological advances and everything, I think it's all holds, or it's free range. You know what I mean?
Well, and then I think part of the problem too, Pat, is the U.S. wouldn't essentially ever be able to leave any of these wars. from Iraq, what it's like 5,500 American soldiers that end up killed. I think is 7,000 if you take a look at contractors and other things like that. Americans died over a decade of war in Iraq. That's an aircraft carrier, right? And so if North Korea sinks an aircraft carrier, if Iran sinks a couple destroyers, then how can we ever end this war? Because the culture of America, of course, is, if you end a war, then you dishonor the people who died in the war, right? And so just as you're saying, with the way that modern warfare is fought, with thousands of men crammed onto these, giant steel vessels out in the middle of water, and the anti-ship capabilities of China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, I do think it would be really, really difficult to ever unwind any of these wars once they started, even if the initial entry into the war had a more realistic goal. Like, look, we're just going to go overthrow the Iranian government, and then we're going to leave, and the Iranian people could do whatever the hell we want. Like, even if that's the goal, once they open that war and the IRGC sinks an American destroyer or aircraft carrier, then we're never going to leave, right? We're never going to leave.
Well, what do you think about the American people's stomach for war? And one thing that you've done some work on that I really appreciated was you covered the recruitment failure of the U.S. Armed Forces to bring in fresh bodies to fill those uniforms. And it seems like the volunteer force, there's a real crisis in our armed services for actually attracting kids to go and fight.
Yeah, so I guess I want to make a big point here because there's a lot of good coverage of this, and I'm very happy that people are talking about this issue. However, a lot of it is being covered by the right, and the right is saying that, well, this is because the woke military, because General Mark Milley, who, just a year ago was calling a U.S. drone strike in Afghanistan that killed 7 children, all innocent people, but 7 children who were just going to greet their uncle or father as he arrived home from work, an innocent man who worked for a U.S.-based charity. He called that strike righteous, right? That's Mr. Woke military that the right is all concerned about. And they're saying that, nobody wants to join the military anymore because basically, it's a lot of poor white people that go into the military and they're just going to be sit there and lectured and called a racist all day long. And I did talk to some people in the military who did tell me, like, this is pretty obnoxious and that, people really don't like it, and that it is, one of those things that, people complain about around the water cooler, in essence, of the military. Right. But then I've talked to a lot of other people who say that, yeah, like they gave us a lecture, but I was allowed to listen to it while I worked. Like, did their other job stuff, and it really wasn't a big deal. And so my guess is that's a little bit of a myth. But if you look at the Pentagon's own polling, I think it's quite transparent that the past 20 years of war, the youth today aren't stupid. They've seen what happened, and they know that. I wrote an article on the. I think I wrote an article on this. There was a study that said 22 soldiers a day that are killing themselves may actually only be half of it, right? Because they only count really people who put a gun to the side of the head and kill themselves, not people who, drink themselves to death, overdose, get in a car accident in the middle of the night while they're, drunk. Pretty clearly that like they were trying to kill themselves, but it gets labeled as a car accident. In part, I'm sure like there's a lot of corners around the country who do that out of the benefit of the families, right? Like if you kill yourself, sometimes life insurance doesn't cover, where if it's an accident, it does. And so anyways, they're saying they really undercount it, the number of soldiers who are killing themselves. But anyways, even the Pentagon's own polling shows like over 50% of young Americans believe they will either have mental or physical disabilities resulting from their time in military service. That's why they're not signing up, because they know if they're sent to Iraq, they're going to be put in a position where, maybe it's them or one of their friends who are going to get killed, or they're going to have to open fire in a situation that could kill some civilians, that's going to ruin them for their entire lives. And that, when they call the VA is going to do next to nothing for them. And I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I think this has like gotten a little bit better. And I don't want to completely say like the VA is terrible with mental health now, because I know there's vets that listen to my show and things like that. And from vets that I've talked to, I think including Matthew Ho told me this, that like it is a lot better. And if you do need help, like you could call, you're probably not going to be in position where you like blow your brains out in the parking lot of a VA facility after you were denied mental health care for the 5th time, right? Like they've made some improvements, but that still is a lot of people's image of the VA is like this just terrible, dysfunctional organization that isn't going to care for you whatsoever once the military breaks you. And so young people don't want to join. They're just making a smart calculation about, you know, what happened with the rest of their lives. And the military is particularly recruiting young women who, 50% of them are going to end up being sexually assaulted in the military. You're never, you know, I mean, every time they like try to propose some legislation to really rein in this problem and to really try to have some accountability, they strip all the teeth out of it in the legislation. And so again, you know, young women aren't stupid. They could read all this. They know that there's a major sexual assault problem in the military. That, you know, if your commanding officer grabs your tit, there's nothing you could do about it, right? Like you just have to deal with it. That's it. You know, it'll probably cost you a promotion because now that commanding officer is going to be afraid that if you get promoted, then you could retaliate against them. So it's going to hurt you in the long run. But if you go tell somebody, nobody's going to care, and it might get you demoted if you do that.
There has been a lot of work. I know on this show, like killing in wars is one of the things that I like to focus on when I get around to it and get a chance to. But we had some coverage, and I'd like to do more interviews about this. So if there are any vets out there who want to talk for an interview on the show, or just want to reach out and tell me about their experience, patrick.mcfarland@libertyweekly.net, just send me an email. But my understanding is that this conception of something called moral injury is something that has been recognized more recently, but it's a more recent development, and they're working on treatment patterns to actually help people through this issue. But the conception of moral injury, it's not a physical wound, and it's not PTSD either. It's its own thing, and it's distinct from that. And so hopefully they are having more better treatment options through the VA, because, you know, as much as we like to rag on the VA being the people that we are, being libertarians, it's a government program. It would be best if it worked the way it was supposed to work, you know, to help people.
Right. And just if anybody's interested, I interviewed Peter Van Buren. It's the old audio only show, Foreign Policy Focus, episode number 300. His book, Cooper's War, is a fiction that deals with moral injury. And I interview him on that old show. It's a really great book. And Peter's a fantastic and very charismatic guest. So you'll absolutely love that episode.
Yeah, I remember that interview. I bought the book from that interview. It's sitting on the shelf. So, this other thing, Kyle, the real concern with the military should be it's the waste in equipment that doesn't work and its actual ability to wage war. I guess if you're a conventional person who thinks we should have a military that works and functions, but we have F-35s that, you know, are falling off the runways of these aircraft carriers, and other things that don't work, and just the general bloat of the military industrial complex. Yeah.
So let's talk about a few weapon systems here and have some fun with this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the F-35s, South Korea just issued a report that last year, for every F-35 they had, was on average only available for service for 11 days out of the entire year, right? So, they have, I don't know, 80, right? So like, aircraft A is available from, January 1st to 11th, aircraft B from the 12th to whatever, right? Like that's how it was. Like, and this year it's no better. They've doubled it, but doubling from 11 to 22 isn't very many days that these aircraft are still available. The F-35 is a complete failure. It's way over budget, and it still doesn't do all the things that it's supposed to do. A lot of times those are now taking off from the Ford class aircraft aircraft carriers that have a ton of problems. I think the biggest one still is the propulsion systems and then the elevators on the aircraft carriers that bring the planes from above to below deck. And so if you're fighting a war, you need the planes to be able to go down, refuel, rearm, and then come back up above deck and take off again, right? And that currently can't really happen, at least consistently, on these aircraft carriers. Of course, the other problem with aircraft carriers is they're really big. They don't maneuver particularly quickly, and they're very susceptible to Chinese. The silkworm is what they used to be called. I forget what they're called now, like CH-17 something or another. These are sea skimmer type of missiles that can apparently just are aircraft killers. I believe Iran, China, and Russia all have those. And then the Zumwalt class destroyers, they're supposed to build like 32. They only ended up building 3 because they were such a disaster. They're a destroyer without a main gun. They tried to initially, I think, put a rail gun on the thing. That didn't work. They tried to put a 155 millimeter precision cannon on the thing. The rounds were $1 million a piece. And so now they're without like a main gun. The hull is meant to be stealth, so it's not picked up on radar. Well, the problem with that is if there's any kind of rough seas or anything, that the ships could tumble and roll really easy. The literal combat ships, LCS, it stands for little crappy ships. The U.S. has built, I don't know, 20 something of these ships, and they're already decommissioning 4 of them, and they're less than 5 years old. I think the USS St. Louis is something like was commissioned in like 2020, and they're already planning to decommission it. The only reason it won't get decommissioned is Congress doesn't like failures, and so they're trying to prevent the Pentagon from scrapping the ships, because the Pentagon says they don't want these ships anymore because they cost more to maintain. They're more trouble than they're worth. And now there's a brand new article by Jeff Shogel at Task and Purpose. This guy, he's a vet, and he rates the Navy over the coals in this article. He's talking about this Orca class autonomous submarine that Boeing got a contract to build with Huntington Ingalls. It's way over budget. It's never going to get done. They're going to waste billions of dollars on this thing that's never going to actually exist or have any purpose in the U.S. military. Sorry. And yeah, it's terrible. So it's trillions of dollars just absolutely wasted. And this is the thing, Pat, the people who want to build all these weapon systems are the people who constantly are yelling and screaming about how I don't take threats seriously enough and I'm putting their lives at risk. And yet then they go and build weapon systems that don't even work. And so if they fight all these wars that they're intent on fighting, they'll probably lose. I don't actually know if the U.S. would lose any of these wars, but if the F-35s don't work against the Chinese and Russian planes, that the aircraft carriers get sunk, then it's going to make it very difficult for the U.S. to actually win any of these wars.
Just a couple notes on that. I mean, it seems to me like one of the issues with the hypersonic missiles and the aircraft carriers is that the actual planes don't have the range that the hypersonic missiles do. So essentially, I mean, if you want to make like a boxing comparison, the reach is further, so China can sit out there and just punch down aircraft carriers without being touched, basically.
Right. And this has been after the U.S. under Obama started the pivot to Asia, deploying more military forces like within range of the Chinese mainland, China responded by their defense policy is area access, area denial. They don't want and don't have any intention of launching strikes against claiming Hawaii, taking Guam, invading San Francisco. None of that is in the Chinese concern in the least. They want to keep the Americans away from Taiwan. And so they've developed weapons that are very effective from the Chinese mainland to use as the U.S. tries to cross the Pacific and deliver their military assets to what they call the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, some of these South China Sea islands that they want to build up militarily. The New York Times recently reported that the White House's goal now is to turn Taiwan into a huge arms depot. That's not like, Kyle reading between the lines. That's what the New York Times is saying that the White House is trying to do.
Yeah, and let it not be forgotten that we're talking about a place on the absolute opposite side of the world from where we live. I think that bears repeating.
Right. The idea that we could defend Taiwan from China is basically having the conception that, the Pacific Ocean is no more than Lake Superior, and it's just a matter of moving the ships from one side to the other, no problem. It's far more complicated than that. And our military is logistically incompetent. They can't even in peacetime effectively ship weapons from base to base, from branch to branch. They constantly don't have the parts they need because they're sitting in warehouses in different places, because the barcode scanners for the Navy aren't the same ones for the Air Force, and crazy reasons why the military is a logistical nightmare. And during wartime, you really had to wonder if they would be able to get the assets where they need to in order to fight the war and that they're trying to fight.
Wait, so you're not just coming up with a hyperbolic example? Like, that's a literal example of the problems that the logistics has, is that the Navy barcodes are different than the other branches?
It was about 5 years ago. There was a ProPublica piece on this. It actually ended up with like some part for a strategic weapon. It's not like they accidentally set the Taiwanese a nuclear warhead or something like that, but they have mistakenly sent the Taiwanese like some piece that was used in the strategic puzzle to deliver a nuclear weapon. You know what I mean? So these kind of things have happened, and it's documented.
Well, I came across, there was a Reuters piece when I was writing my last article about Tsai Ing-wen and the U.S. aid and the proposed Taiwan Policy Act. There's an article saying that because of COVID, right, there's like $14 billion of military equipment that have not yet been delivered to Taiwan, that are years behind schedule in arms sales that we've sold to them.
Yeah, I know part of them are the advanced Patriot missiles that they've agreed to sell Taiwan, that I think are way backed up. And I don't know if, maybe Taiwan's going to get deprioritized even more to deliver those systems to Eastern Europe or something like that. But, this is the case with a lot of different weapon systems. Israel is waiting on refueling tankers that are pretty essential to their war plans for going to war with Iran. And they might not get those until 2025, I think, at the earliest. Now, I think those are Boeing, and those air tankers are way behind. And I think at one point the U.S. somebody was trying to get the White House to step out of line and let Israel go to the front for those refueling tankers, because they're so important to their ability to bomb Iran without having to use bases either in the UAE or Saudi Arabia or something like that. So a lot of these weapon systems are kind of in that status, especially when you're talking about, we approved all these weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Well, some of the stuff isn't going to get delivered for some time. Yeah,
I think that's important to note. So we have about 7 minutes here. I want to be respectful of your time, man. But as much as you could, what does the next 2 or 3 years look like? I mean, we can't predict the future, but it's just very concerning with, like I said, it seems like this full court press, things seem to be happening a lot faster than even you or I or Dave DeCamp thought they would.
So I agree. I guess, the one thing you had to remember is America is the world empire, and Washington does have elections coming up. And so maybe the position of the Biden administration starts to shift a little bit after the midterm elections. Maybe Biden feels he could let his foot off the gas a little bit on the militarism when it comes to Russia or something like that. I just don't see it. And so, I feel like, Pat, right now we're on a road, right? And we know that 50 miles down the road, it's a gorge, right? And we're just going to drive our car right into the gorge. Now, there's a bunch of exit ramps between now and then, but you're in the back seat of the car and everybody around you is going, gorge, 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 gorge. And the driver is just putting their foot further and further on the accelerator. Now, again, we're a long ways from nuclear warfare here. I don't want to set off too many alarms, but there's nobody that's starting to say hey, do we really want to die today? It doesn't seem like there's any of that conversation going on. We're not coming back to reality at all. It's all just about what the White House thinks is the best way to present, the foreign policy to the American people to win elections. And I don't even think it's accurate. I wrote a couple articles recently for the Institute on some polling that showed, I think, 2/3 in a growing number. So, it was 60% in 2021, and now it's 65% in 2022. Those number of Americans want diplomacy, even with adversaries. They're not, the political consensus in Washington that if you talk to Iran, you're appeasing the Ayatollah. And this whole year, I'm sure you remember when Donald Trump was going to meet with Kim Jong-un. People were literally it didn't even make sense. They were saying that Donald Trump was going to put America in danger. He could somehow trade away Hawaii to Kim Jong-un, right? It wasn't even on the table that America would ever be in danger. And yet, these fictions are invented whenever our leaders try to talk, with anybody, but it's all within the Washington political class. If you look at the American people, 72% of Republicans, according to this poll, want the Americans to continue to talk to the Iranians. And hell, you can't even get the Democratic Senator Bob Menendez is a part of Joe Biden's policy. He's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, maybe the most important senator on foreign policy. And he's, a stalwart against any kind of diplomacy with Iran. Iran is absolutely baffling, Pat, that, the president can't even get high-ranking members of his own party in line. Like Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. Biden said he didn't want that to happen, and yet the Speaker of the House went and started all this as military escalation with Taiwan as Biden's trying to wage a war in Ukraine. This is just absolutely bad shit how far away from the American people our political class and the political consensus is. And, it's, I guess, it seems like this could be resolved really, really, really easy, Pat. And so, in a couple weeks from now, this war could be over if motivated parties stepped up and made that their priority. But nobody is doing that. There's no interest in it whatsoever. And in fact, all the people who are anywhere near power, have anywhere near the ability to do that, all believe that if they do that, then somehow they're servants of Russian President Vladimir Putin and part of the enemy. This is like when I was a kid again, and anybody who's saying, whoa, maybe Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, they say, okay, so you're fighting for Osama bin Laden now. That's the equivalent of our political rhetoric today. But I guess the good news is that mostly just exists around Washington. The bad news is nobody could get close enough to Washington to smash some sense into anybody and get anything done in a positive direction.
Yeah, it didn't have to be this way, man. What if Ron Paul was elected in 2012 or 2008? So, yeah. All right, brother. Well, I know where people can find you, but do you want to remind the audience?
Yeah. So again, antiwar.com. I'm the opinion editor, so read the viewpoints there. I also write news stories for antiwar.com, almost always on Fridays. So over the weekend, if you check out the news section there, that'll typically be my stories. I write mostly foreign policy stories for the Libertarian Institute. I try to do 2-3 stories a day, not quite at the pace Safety Camp puts them out, but I do put out several stories a day. I've been on the North Korea beat for the past few months now, trying to just really keep up and pay attention to this. And I know, look, with all the stuff happening with Russia and China, hell, everybody's got to put the North Korea stuff on the back burner. At the same time, this escalation is getting really out of hand, and it could get to a point where it boils over when nobody is actually paying attention to it. So I want to make sure somebody does. And then conflicts of interest is my show. Right now, the co-host is Connor Freeman. Will Porter started the show with me. He's my main guy, but he's taking a bad seat on the show, so he's not there anymore. But I do write articles with Will and Connor pretty frequently. So check out everything I do. And thanks so much for having me back on, Pat. Oh, at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. I'm banned from Facebook.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot. Yeah, well, love all you guys. Thanks for everything that you do. I wanted to remind the audience too. Well, I'm on TikTok now at Patrick McFarland or at Pat McFarland _. It's the same handle for Twitter and TikTok. Trying to reach all those kids who are going to be cannon fodder if these wars ever kick off. So TikTok there, and then YouTube as well. I'm doing shorts. So if you want to go subscribe on YouTube there. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot, Kyle. We'll catch you later.
Thank you, Pat.